Hello and welcome to our webinar today entitled Quick Meals for Performance with McGill Dietetic intern Justine Chriqui. Justine will be explaining the basics of nutrition for performance, which involves strategies for fueling and recovery after your training and general nutrition habits that have been shown to help promote health and performance. Justine will also be preparing orange soy tofu pockets. Thanks, Justine, for preparing this session for us, and we look forward to learning from you today.
Thank you so much, Taya, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. I am so excited to lead the discussion regarding quick meals for performance today. I hope you learn a lot and enjoy the recipe demo. So I'll just start off with our outline for the presentation today. The first topic I'll discuss relates to some nutrition basics, and this will provide us with some foundational knowledge that we will then build off of during the next two sections, which are nutrition for you, the athlete, as well as factors affecting performance. Then I will introduce some tips for meal prepping as well as food safety, and I'll end off on the demo for the orange soy tofu pocket recipe. So just some quick objectives for the presentation. By the end, you should be able to identify sources of carbohydrates, proteins, healthy fats, and vitamins and minerals that will fuel your performance. You should also be able to choose beverages that will keep you hydrated and provide you with a good source of electrolytes. And finally, you should be able to list at least one way to incorporate meal prepping into your routine. So let's get started on some basics. Here we have all of the essential nutrients that we need in a day. They're essential because we cannot live nor function without them. So first we have our macronutrients, which are our carbohydrates, our proteins, and our fats. They're called macronutrients because they're needed in larger quantities, and they're responsible for giving us the majority of the energy that we need in a day. Then we have our micronutrients, which are our vitamins and our minerals. This also includes our electrolytes. They're called micronutrients because they are needed in smaller quantities, but despite this, they still play very, very dynamic roles in the body. The last nutrient that we'll discuss is water, and water is important for many, many functions, including staying hydrated and maintaining fluid balance. So let's go into a little more detail about each of these nutrients. We'll start off with carbohydrates or carbs, and this nutrient is our body's main source of fuel for our cells, our tissues, our organs. They're used quite quickly after being eaten, and when there's extra carbs, they're stored as glycogen to be used at a later time. So I just want you to remember glycogen for a little bit later in the presentation because we'll discuss this molecule a little bit further. So as you may be aware, there are different types of carbohydrates. First, we have our sugars, and this is the most basic form of carbohydrate. It provides the quickest energy supply because our bodies don't really need to break them down in order to use them. These sugars are directly absorbed into our cells. Sugars are also known as simple carbs or simple sugars. Examples include the sugar that are found in sweets, as well as processed foods, soft drinks. It's also found in the natural sugars of fruits as well. Next, we have our starches, and starches are actually chains of these simple sugars. They provide a slower release of energy because our body needs the time to break those chains down into the individual sugars. Starches are also known as complex carbohydrates, and examples include the starches that are found in breads, pastas, potatoes, corn, bananas, and other products as well. Lastly, we have fiber, and fiber is actually a type of complex carb, but humans can't break them down. So despite this, fiber is still very important for our overall well-being. It helps us stay full, it keeps us regular, and it has lots of other benefits as well. Fiber is found in products called whole foods, and these are our fruits, our vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, and our whole grains as well. So let's move on to our proteins. And just like sugar is the most basic unit of carbs, amino acids are the most basic unit of proteins. So there are 20 different amino acids that all combine to make the proteins that our bodies need. 11 of these 20 are classified as non-essential amino acids, meaning that our bodies make them in adequate amounts. The remaining 9 amino acids are classified as essential, and this is because our bodies do not make them, so the only way to obtain them is by eating them. Proteins play a variety of structural, functional, and regulatory roles in the body, and this includes making and maintaining muscles, bones, enzymes, and hormones. In terms of the types of proteins that we consume, complete protein sources contain all 9 of those essential amino acids that I just talked about. So examples include all animal sources of protein. So this is our chicken, our meats, our fish, dairy as well. And there's also some plant-based sources like soy, quinoa, and amaranth. Incomplete proteins, on the other hand, do not contain all 9 essential amino acids in adequate amounts. So, plant-based sources of proteins, for example, they'll contain different quantities of these 9 essential amino acids. So, when we combine different sources, they can make a complete protein. The most common combination of incomplete proteins are beans with rice or corn. But overall, if you eat a variety of protein foods throughout the day, you'll be able to meet those needs. So let's move on to our last macronutrient of the day, which is our fats. And fats are energy-rich nutrient sources that are very important for our overall health. They have roles in energy storage, organ protection, nutrient absorption, especially of our fat-soluble vitamins. They also play roles in hormone production and others as well. There are four main types of fats, one being our saturated fats, which are most often found in animal-based foods, so our meats, our eggs, our dairy. There's also trans fats, which are most often found in processed foods and sweets. They're normally added to these products. And it's recommended that these two sources of fat, so our saturated and trans fats, should be restricted or at least consumed less often because they've been found to increase the risk of health complications like heart disease. Monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats are the last two fats we'll discuss today, and they're most often found in plant-based foods such as our avocados, our nuts, our seeds, vegetable oils like avocado oil or olive oil, soybean oil, and these fats are also found in fatty fish like salmon and tuna. So when it comes to these unsaturated fats, they should be substituted for our saturated and trans fats whenever possible. And this is because they've actually been shown to improve the cholesterol levels in our blood and can in turn decrease the risk of heart disease. So let's move on to our vitamins and minerals. These, as I mentioned, are our micronutrients, meaning they're needed in smaller amounts. If we are lacking these small amounts, though, it can be very detrimental to our health. So, all of the vitamins and minerals that we need are found in all of the foods that we eat. And that being said, eating a colorful and varied diet remains the best way to meet your vitamin and mineral needs without supplementation. Vitamins and minerals perform hundreds of roles in our body, and this includes bone formation, wound healing, supporting the immune system, producing energy from our macronutrients, and a variety of other functions as well. Examples of our vitamins and minerals include vitamins A, C, and D, folate, iron, iodine, and dozens of others. So, as I mentioned, we'll talk about electrolytes, and electrolytes are actually types of minerals. They're found in our body fluids like our blood, our urine, our sweat. They're also found in our tissues. And electrolytes perform a variety of functions, such as helping balance water in our body, balance our body's pH. They help transport nutrients into and transport waste out of cells. They maintain the functioning of the heart, the nerves, the muscles, the brain. So they're very important for all of the functions that we need in a day. Electrolytes include sodium, calcium, potassium, chloride, bicarbonate, phosphate, and magnesium. And they're found in pretty much everything that we eat or drink, with very rich sources being from coconut water, sports drinks, milk, soup broths, and a variety of other items as well. So, speaking of all of those fluids, let's talk about water, which is the final essential nutrient that we'll be discussing. It's essential because it helps our bodies do things like regulate our body temperature, lubricate our organs and our joints. Water helps dissolve and transport nutrients as well as oxygen. It also helps our kidneys remove waste. There's many other functions that water performs as well. And just a fun fact, our bodies are made of up to 60% water. So for this reason, it's very important that we drink enough fluid in order to stay hydrated, especially when we're exercising and recovering from exercise. So there are some fluids that we should choose less often, and this includes our caffeinated beverages, alcohol, and this is because they trigger a reaction in our body that makes us lose more water, and this is often through our urine. So that being said, I'm not saying to stop drinking these beverages. It's just enjoy them in moderation. And it's important to choose non-caffeinated and non-alcoholic beverages more often. And this includes our water, milk, herbal teas, etc. So now that we've discussed these essential nutrients, let's talk about the guidelines for putting it all together. The 2019 version of the Canada's Food Guide got rid of the traditional food groups and the associated servings, and they actually moved towards a plate-based method. So in this method, it's recommended that half of your plate contains fruits or vegetables, a quarter of your plate contains protein foods, and with an emphasis on plant-based sources such as legumes, nuts, seeds, tofu, and they also suggest having meat and dairy in moderation. And the final quarter of our plate should consist of whole grains. So these are things like our whole wheat breads, pastas, rice, quinoa, barley, and other grain products as well. It's also recommended that water should be your drink of choice. So, when following this plate method, not only will the general population adequately meet all of their needs for the essential nutrients that we discussed, but research has actually shown that it can decrease your risk of complications like cancer, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes. So, along with this plate recommendation, the Canada's Food Guide includes tips for maintaining a healthy lifestyle. And this includes things like cooking more often, enjoying meals with others, and this includes virtually too during the pandemic, and also using food labels. So, when it comes to reading these food labels, we can break it down into four main steps. The first step includes looking at the serving size as well as the calories per serving. It's important to compare these servings to the amount that you actually eat. So, for example, on this nutrition label, we can see that one serving includes 6 crackers and at 120 calories. So, if you're anything like me, you're not going to be just eating 6 crackers in one serving. You might double that, you might even triple that amount. And so, it's important to also double the calories and the other nutrient values that you see on this food label. And so, this leads us to our second step, which is looking at the percent daily value. So these numbers that are circled indicate the percent of each nutrient that you're eating compared to the amount that the average adult needs in a day. So for example, when you eat one serving of these crackers, you'll be consuming 5% of the total fat that an adult needs in a day. And when it comes to understanding the percent daily values, a tip to remember, and you can think of this dial here, is that 5% or less of a nutrient means that there's a little bit of that nutrient in a serving. When there's 15% or more, that means that there's a lot of that nutrient in a serving. So now that we know how to tell when there is a little and there is a lot of a nutrient, let's look at the nutrients to consume less often and more often. So nutrients to consume less often are our total fats, saturated fats, trans fats, sodium, and cholesterol. And this means that we should be on our food labels, we should be trying to choose products with 5% or less of these nutrients whenever possible. Nutrients to consume more often or with 15% or greater per serving on a food label. This includes our fiber and our vitamins and our minerals. So this leads us to our first poll question of the day. I encourage you to click the link for the webinar poll questions on the right of your screen. And this can be found under the links and downloads section. And that way you can participate in these polls. So once you're there, feel free to answer the first question, and that is which nutrient is or which nutrients are in high amounts for one serving of the following item. Is it potassium, calcium, iron, all of the above, or none of the above? So if you answered D, all of the above, then you are correct. And that is because one serving of this item provides over 15% of the potassium, calcium, and iron that the average adult needs. So now that we've discussed some of those nutrition basics, let's move on to some nutrition considerations for you, the athlete. And I'll just start with a quick summary of what happens when we exercise. So when we exercise, our bodies burn calories for fuel. And these calories, they mainly come from our glycogen stores, but also from our muscles. And within our muscles are some stored fats, as well as the muscle tissue itself. So every time we exercise, our muscles actually break down slightly, and this causes micro tears to occur. And the micro tears happen so that when our muscle tries to rebuild, it can actually grow bigger. So because our bodies respond to exercise in this way, our bodies will, like I said, they'll try to rebuild. And they do this by first replenishing our glycogen stores and also by repairing our muscle tissues, those micro tears that I mentioned. Because of these processes, athletes need to make sure that they're eating adequate amounts of carbohydrates as well as proteins. So let's dive right into that. If we look specifically at carbohydrates, research has shown that consuming rich sources of carbs before and during exercise actually improves our performance. And this is where we'll bring back the discussion about glycogen. When we eat more carbs, more glycogen can be stored. And so the more glycogen will be available for fueling our performance. The concept of carb loading actually builds off of this, as a traditional pattern for carb loading is 4 low carb eating days while we exercise, followed by 3 high carb eating days without exercising or doing so minimally. And this has actually been found to optimize the way that our bodies store glycogen. So since glycogen is so important for performance, it should be noted that athletes should avoid fasting before training, and this includes that overnight fast while we're sleeping. This is because during fasting periods, our bodies continue to break down our glycogen stores to meet the basic or the basal needs for functioning, for our body functioning. So when our stores become low, this can impair performance, especially for endurance athletes who really rely on those glycogen stores for longer periods of time. Moving on to protein and performance. As I previously mentioned, proteins are needed for fueling exercise as well as repairing the muscle afterwards. And it's true that athletes' protein needs are higher than the general population, but there is very little benefit for athletes eating more protein than is needed. So your protein needs will vary depending on things like your personal characteristics as well as your sport. And so it's always a good idea to contact a dietitian like Taya, for example, in order to determine what your needs really are. So with that, eating a high protein diet, meaning one that exceeds your needs, it's actually not recommended for athletes. This is partially because some protein sources also contain higher amounts of fat, and this includes this is especially true with animal sources of protein. And so with higher protein and therefore fat intakes, the lower the opportunity will be for consuming your carbohydrates and also subsequently storing glycogen. So I just want to put all of this into perspective. So here are some food plates that you can use to help you decide what to eat while you're training or depending on your training intensity. So during periods of easy training, your plate should look pretty much the same as that Canada Food Guide model. So here we have our half plates of fruits and vegetables, a quarter plate of protein, and the quarter plate of our whole grains. During periods of moderate training, you should try to put more emphasis on your carb sources, such as your fresh fruits as well as your grains. And so here, you should try to consume about a third of your plate as carb sources, still a quarter of your plate as protein, and then the rest as your vegetables. Finally, during periods of hard training, and this also includes on an event day, your plate should look quite different. So about half of your plate should consist of those grains, also having some of those fruits. A quarter of your plate should still only contain those protein sources. And then the final quarter should contain those vegetables. And so this could be used as a guide for when you are deciding what to eat. So now that we've talked about those nutrition basics, also the nutrition considerations for athletes, let's discuss some factors that could affect or alter your performance. So one factor that could alter your performance is dehydration. We are constantly losing water throughout the day, and this can happen through urination, breathing, and sweating. When our intake does not match our losses, we become dehydrated, and this can cause a variety of unpleasant symptoms like heat exhaustion or even heat stroke. Ways to ensure adequate fluid intakes is number one, do not restrict any fluids at any time before, during, or after you exercise. Along with this, you can actually weigh yourself before and after you exercise to help you monitor the amount of fluid loss. So a trick for rehydrating in this case is for each pound lost, you should drink around 500 milliliters of fluid. Additionally, it's important not to rely on your thirst mechanism. And this is because water loss is already serious by the time it kicks in, so it's not as reliable. Another factor that can alter performance is electrolyte imbalance. And this can actually result from dehydration, but it also occurs because it occurs when we sweat. So we sweat a lot during exercise, and therefore we will lose a significant amount of electrolytes that need to be replenished. And if we don't replenish them, we can risk fatigue, lethargy, gastrointestinal upset, and sometimes even more severe symptoms. So when it comes to rehydrating and replenishing those electrolyte losses, it's actually carb and electrolyte rich fluids that are preferred to water because these sources can not only help replenish our fluid and electrolyte losses, but the sugars will also help them, or will also help you begin to replenish your glycogen stores. So speaking of those glycogen stores, glycogen depletion is another factor that affects performance. It occurs when glycogen stores are critically low, and we discussed that this could be because of fasting or not eating enough carbs. And glycogen depletion occurs gradually, especially over heavy training days or repeated high-intensity exercise. So when our glycogen stores are depleted, we cannot sustain optimal exercise. And some athletes term this hitting the wall because it really feels like they've, smacked into a wall and they just cannot perform any longer. So the final factors affecting performance that we'll discuss today are the timing of foods and fluids. As a general rule, the closer you are to beginning your training session or your event, the smaller and more carb-rich your snack should be. So for example, if your training session is going to start within the hour, try having something like soda crackers and a sports drink. And this is because these items do not contain any fiber, they don't contain any nutrients that need to be broken down, so they're very easily digested, they're easily absorbed, and they won't sit like a brick in your stomach before you start exercising. If you're a little farther away from exercising, say between 2 and 3 hours, choosing a snack with a carb and a protein source would be best. And this can consist of, let's say, crackers with cheese, maybe peanut butter instead. And you can have this alongside a smoothie. This is because these foods are light enough that they'll be digested by the time that you start exercising. Lastly, if you know that you won't be exercising for many hours, you should consume a meal, especially one that emphasizes carbohydrates and protein. So something like the orange soy tofu pockets, for example, that I'll be demoing, it can be a great meal to have alongside a protein shake because it does have a good source of carbs and protein. I also want to emphasize that that these rules apply to any time of the day. So, for example, if you've woken up 2 hours before you start training, make sure that you eat something like a snack with a carb and protein source so that you don't start training while fasted, because we know that when we train while fasted, it can hinder our performance. Once you do start exercising, it is important to replenish those fluid and electrolyte losses, like I previously mentioned. You should try to focus on consuming sources of simple sugars as well as electrolytes, and this is so that they're absorbed easily while you're performing. A trick for avoiding dehydration in this case is to have around 250 mils of fluid every 15 minutes of activity. So before we move on to the next session, I just want to quickly discuss a condition called relative energy deficiency in sport, or RED-S. And RED-S happens when athletes do not eat enough calories in order to meet their needs. So anyone who is physically active is at risk for RED-S, especially those who have those heavy training schedules and who are, let's say, in their in season. And so some factors that can increase your risk of RED-S include following a rigid food pattern, having a lack of variety in foods, and also following fad diets that restrict your intake. So RED-S can have three main effects on your health and your performance. First, less energy will be available for your training period, and when you have less energy, you can experience things like early fatigue, a loss of strength, and this also includes a loss of muscle mass, and it can also lead to things like poor concentration. A telltale sign of RED-S is actually a loss of menstrual periods in those who menstruate. And this is because when we underfuel our body, our estrogen production decreases, and this can eventually stop your menses altogether. Related to this is actually a loss of bone mass. So in those who menstruate, this is directly related to lower estrogen levels. And this is because estrogen is essential for bone health and building our bone. However, you don't need to, be menstruating or have menstruations in order to experience this. Underfueling can cause any athlete to lose bone mass, and this increases the risk of unexplained injury and stress factors as well. So this just shows how important it is to make sure that you're meeting your needs, and that way you can perform your best. So this leads us to our next poll question of the day. True or false, eating protein is important for building glycogen stores? And if you chose false, then you are correct, because we build our glycogen stores from carbohydrate sources, not protein. The next poll question I have for you is, what beverage should be chosen 1 hour before a training session or an event? So from these answers, if you chose A, then yes, you are correct, because a sports drink will be important for providing those sugars that will help fuel your performance. If you chose water, it is acceptable as long as it is alongside that sports drink. So without further ado, let's move on to our meal prepping and food safety tips. So here are 5 tips that can help you organize your meals throughout the week if you do choose to meal prep. First is finding the recipes to plan those meals. I find that when I plan out my meals, even just having like a rough idea, it significantly decreases the amount of time that I spend deciding what I want to eat. So it can be a huge, huge time saver when we do this. Another tip is keeping the healthy plate or the other athlete plate if you're training more intensely, keeping one of those plates in mind so that you can meet those needs that you have. It's also important to gather the tools that you'll need in order to store that food. So this can include things like containers or jars, freezer bags as well. Really anything for storing the food in the fridge or freezer. A fourth tip that I have for you is choosing the day or the days that you're going to prep your meals. So I like to do this on the weekend just because that's normally when I have more downtime. But if you have more downtime on a Wednesday night, feel free to do that. It's really just catering your meal prepping days to your schedule so you can save as much of that precious time as you can. A final tip for today that I have is taking advantage of your freezer. And this is a real huge time saver because, for example, something I like to do is I make really large batches of a food, of a meal. I store away the portions that I want to eat for the week in the fridge. And then the remaining portions I put in either a container or a freezer bag, and I store that in the freezer so that, let's say, 2 weeks later, if I want to eat that again, I can just take it out of the freezer, pop it in the fridge, and enjoy it the next day or sometime in the next few days. So finally, let's talk about food safety before we move on to the demo. Number one, make sure that you wash your hands periodically. And this includes before you start preparing your food, after you touch items like your raw meats, poultry, and seafood, as well as washing your hands after you've finished. And this will all avoid risks of contamination from harmful bacteria that can make you sick. It's also important to make sure that your tools are clean. So making sure that your knife and your cutting board, any utensils, serving plates, serving spoons, anything you're using, you want to make sure that that is clean. And alongside this, it's important to separate your raw meat, poultry, and seafood from other foods like your vegetables. And this includes separating things like your cutting boards or using separate cutting boards and knives and other items to, again, avoid some of that cross contamination. Finally, it's important to place all of those raw meats, chicken, uh, seafood, sorry, at the bottom of your fridge so that if any of those juices seep from the containers of those items, it doesn't drip below onto any items in your fridge. Another important concept for food safety is considering the temperature danger zone. And this is a zone between 4 and 60 degrees Celsius where bacteria like Salmonella really grow best. So if you do end up leaving food in this temperature danger zone, just make sure that it's for a maximum of 2 hours because anything past this creates that optimal environment for the harmful bacteria to grow. So here's our last poll question. And here I just invite you to list one meal prepping tip that you might find useful to add to your routine. Feel free to list one of the 5 that we discussed or something new if you'd like. It's really up to you. And so here I will begin the recipe demo for the orange soy tofu pockets. So as pictured here, we have the pockets, and in terms of equipment that you'll need some measuring spoons, a knife, you'll need some tongs, a cutting board, you'll need a grater, a Tupperware with a lid, you'll also need a measuring cup, and you'll need your stove and a frying pan. So let's get started on the marinade. First, you'll want to zest an orange until you get about half a teaspoon's worth. And for me, this took about the first layer of that whole orange. Once you have that, you'll add that to your Tupperware, and then you'll add 3 tablespoons of orange juice. So I decided to juice the orange that I had, but you can just use store-bought juice as well if you'd like. Next, you'll add 2 tablespoons of soy sauce, and then you'll add 2 teaspoons of sesame oil. Once you add that to your Tupperware, you'll add a 1/4 teaspoon of sriracha. In my opinion, this recipe wasn't very spicy, so if you do want to make it even spicier, you can add more. To the Tupperware, then you will add 2 teaspoons of freshly minced ginger. And once you do that, you'll do the same thing with a clove of garlic. And so when that's all minced nicely, you'll get started on cutting your block of tofu into 12 pieces. So a trick here that I used was cutting it in half, then cutting it in quarters, and then cutting each quarter into thirds so that I had 12 even pieces. After you're done with that, you'll want to mix your marinade, make sure all the ingredients are incorporated well, and you'll add your tofu to that marinade. Once you're done with that, you'll give it a nice stir, make sure that everything is coated, and you'll add that to your refrigerator and let it marinate for around 15 minutes. But this can be done for up to a day as well. So feel free to do anything you'd like in the meantime. In the meantime, for me, I decided to prep my veggies. So I started by slicing 2/3 of a cup of carrots. Then I added 2 cups of spinach to my measuring cup. And then I halved my 3 whole wheat pitas. And I did this by cutting one in half and then using that as a template for the rest. So when it comes to cooking our tofu, you'll turn your stove on to medium-high heat, and then you'll heat your pan with some oil and add your tofu. When you've done that, you will flip the pieces halfway through. This takes about 3 minutes, and then you will set it on a plate to cool. And because my pan was not big enough for all 12 pieces, I continued with my second batch. So I added the rest, I flipped them halfway, and then I stored them on my plate. When you're done, you'll want to make sure you turn off your stove and wash your hands to get ready for making the pita pockets. So with the leftover sauce, I added it to both sides of the tofu. And you can do this with the tofu because when it's raw, it doesn't seep any of that harmful bacteria into the marinade. If you were doing something like this with chicken, you should not use any of that leftover marinade. But once you're done with that, you'll want to fill your pockets. So you will add 2 slices of tofu to each half pocket, and then you'll stuff that with your veggies. Because my pitas were a little bit smaller, I had to cut my pieces of tofu in half. So I ended up having 4 half slices with my veggies, and I turned that into my tofu pockets. So bon appetit. I hope you guys enjoy this recipe and really try to make it your own. And looking at some of the allergens for this recipe, I have some allergen substitutions. There is soy in this recipe, and this is in the form of soy sauce, which you can substitute with something like tamari or coconut aminos for a similar flavor. For the tofu, you can try doing this with a meat source like chicken or fish. Um, for the sesame oil in the recipe, you can substitute that with some vegetable oil. And for the wheat in the pita, you can try substituting the pita with either some gluten-free bread or a gluten-free tortilla. In terms of the nutrition facts, so each serving, which is one fully stuffed pita, has about 350 calories, 18% of your daily fat, and this includes mostly heart-healthy unsaturated fats. It also has about 30% of your daily sodium needs. This is on the higher side, but if you do consume this before you start exercising, you'll be sweating out lots of sodium anyway, so that's all right. And also this pocket, as I mentioned, is a good source of carbs as well as protein. It also has a good source of fiber and vitamins and minerals. Looking at the cost of this recipe, it is quite cost effective. As you can see, each serving of the tofu pocket, so the full pita, costs about $2.25. And when we compare this to a similar item from a restaurant, this can cost about $8. So you can see that even just by making this yourself, you save nearly a quarter of the cost, or it's nearly a quarter of the cost to make, and you can actually control exactly what goes into it. Another great thing that you can do with this recipe is using some of that leftover tofu and veggies. You can repurpose them into other dishes. So, for example, you can use those leftovers and make a vegetable stir fry. You can add it to soups, maybe some rice noodles. You can also add it to a green salad. There's lots of options that you can choose from, but really have fun with it, make it your own. So, on that note, I just want to leave you with a final statement, and that is that that performance improves when your diet meets your needs, and when we eat well, we perform well, and we recover well. So, here are my references if you'd like any more information. And I want to thank you so much for your attention today. I hope that you learned a lot. I hope you try this recipe because it really is quite yummy. And if you do have any questions of the sorts, please feel free to book an appointment with Taya, and you can reach her at the following contact information.
Thanks so much, Justine. I can't wait to make that. I've got my tofu in the fridge. Please join us for other webinars in the future and view our Perform webinar page for more Perform content. We also appreciate your feedback and suggestions, and we ask you to take time to complete the brief survey link on the Perform webinar page to your right, I believe. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.